Why did Jesus pray to God if he was God? Have you ever wondered, if Jesus was truly God, why did he pray? Was he talking to himself? Was he weaker than the Father? Or was there something deeper, something more powerful happening when Jesus kneeled in prayer? My friends, this question is not just theological. It holds the key to unlocking the profound mystery of who Jesus is and what he came to show us. Because when Jesus prayed, he wasn't just performing a ritual, he was revealing divine truth. He was demonstrating something so powerful that it still shakes the foundations of heaven and earth today. And in this message, I'm about to break it all down for you. 4 reasons Jesus prayed to God. But let me warn you, this is not just another Bible study. This revelation is going to shift your understanding, deepen your faith, and transform how you see prayer, power, and purpose. So if you are ready to go deeper into the mystery of the incarnation, if you are ready to uncover the divine reason behind Jesus' prayer life, then keep watching. Number 1, the mystery of the incarnation, the divine paradox. My friends, the incarnation is the divine paradox, the staggering reality that Jesus was fully God and fully man at the same time. The Apostle John declares this truth boldly. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. John 1:14. Paul reinforces this by proclaiming, "For in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily." Colossians 2:9. How can this be? How can the infinite, eternal, all-powerful God step into human form? This is the mystery of the incarnation, the moment where heaven kissed earth, where the limitless one chose to limit himself, where the creator of all entered into his own creation, and this mystery is the key to understanding why Jesus prayed. He was not praying as a lesser being to a greater being, but as the Son in his humanity, modeling what it means to live in total dependence on the Father. Imagine a king who rules over a vast and mighty kingdom. He is clothed in royal garments, his word is law, and his power is unquestioned. Yet one day he chooses to take off his robes, set aside his scepter, and dress as a commoner. He steps into the streets to live among his people, not because he has lost his kingship, but because he wants to experience life as they do. He willingly limits himself, not by losing his power, but by refusing to use it for his own benefit. This is what Jesus did. Philippians 2:6-8 reveals the depth of his humility. Who, being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. This is known as kenosis, the self-emptying of Christ. He did not lose his divinity, but he chose to veil it. He walked as we walk, felt as we feel, hungered as we hunger, suffered as we suffer, so that he could be our perfect high priest, able to sympathize with our weaknesses. Hebrews 4:15. But why did Jesus pray? Because he was fully human, and in his humanity, he showed us how to live in complete dependence on the Father. Prayer was not a sign of inferiority, but a demonstration of relationship. Jesus prayed because he came to fulfill all righteousness, to model the perfect life of obedience, trust, and submission. If the sinless Son of God, who had all power, depended on prayer, how much more do we need to? Jesus was demonstrating the ultimate example, that true strength is found in submission to the Father. He was showing us that humility is not weakness, but power under control. Think of an Olympic runner. He has trained his entire life. He has the strength, the skill, the ability to run without limits. But when the time comes to compete, he follows the rules. He stays in his lane. He does not run wherever he pleases, though he has the power to do so. He submits to the structure set before him because he knows that victory comes through discipline. Jesus, though fully God, willingly ran the race of humanity according to the limitations of the flesh, not because he had to, but because he chose to. His prayer life was not a mark of weakness, but a sign of his total dependence on the Father as our example. This truth transforms the way we live. Jesus, in his humanity, teaches us that dependence on God is the ultimate source of power. We live in a world that glorifies self-sufficiency. Society tells us that independence is strength and that asking for help is weakness. But the kingdom of God operates differently. Jesus flipped the script. He showed us that the secret to victory is not in striving, but in surrender, not in self-reliance, but in God-reliance. The same Jesus who calmed the storm with a word still woke up early to pray, Mark 1:35. The same Jesus who cast out demons still retreated to lonely places to seek the Father, Luke 5:16. The same Jesus who had all authority still declared, "I do nothing on my own, but speak just what the Father has taught me," John 8:28. So what does this mean for us? It means that prayer is not an obligation, it is our lifeline. If Jesus, by his human nature, needed to pray, how much more do we? When we face trials, do we turn to God or try to handle them ourselves? When we feel weak, do we lean on his strength or pretend we have it all together? Jesus teaches us that the path to true power is not through self-sufficiency, but through divine dependence. In prayer, we align ourselves with the will of God. In prayer, we receive wisdom beyond human understanding. In prayer, we exchange our weakness for his strength. And just as Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, "Not my will, but yours be done," Luke 22:42, we too must learn to surrender, trusting that God's way is always higher than ours. Number 2, Jesus is the perfect example of a dependent son. When Jesus prayed, he was not praying from a place of inferiority, but from a place of divine relationship. He was not a lesser being seeking guidance from a greater being. He was the Son in perfect communion with the Father, modeling for us what it means to live in absolute dependence on God. John 5:19 declares, "The Son can do nothing of himself but what he sees the Father do." Now, that doesn't mean Jesus lacked power. It means he refused to operate outside of divine alignment. He was demonstrating that true power comes not from independence, but from intimacy with the Father. And that is where so many of us get it wrong. We believe strength is self-sufficiency, that maturity means needing no one. But in the kingdom of God, dependency is not weakness, it is wisdom. A child does not look to his father because he is incapable. He looks because he trusts. He seeks because he knows his father's wisdom is greater. This is why Jesus prayed, to show us the perfect example of what it means to walk in complete reliance on God, not as a last resort, but as a first response. Picture a young child learning to walk. He grips his father's hand tightly, not because he lacks legs, but because he understands that his father's guidance will keep him steady. He walks in step with his father, moving when he moves, stopping when he stops. He watches, learns, and follows. This is exactly what Jesus did. He did nothing apart from the Father because he chose to walk in divine alignment. He chose to model for us what it means to move in step with the Spirit, to pray not out of ritual, but out of relationship. Luke 5:16 tells us that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places to pray. Now, think about that. The one who spoke the world into existence, John 1:3, still took time to steal away and commune with the Father. Why? Because he was showing us that true power flows from the place of prayer. Society tells us that to be strong is to be independent, that to be powerful is to stand on your own. And yet Jesus, the most powerful being to ever walk on this earth, modeled a life of consistent, humble dependence on the Father. He wasn't praying because he was weak. He was praying because he was wise. He wasn't seeking power. He was showing us where power truly comes from. Every miracle he performed, every word he spoke, every step he took was in perfect sync with the will of the Father. That is why his prayers were so effective. That is why when he spoke, demons trembled. That is why when he commanded, nature obeyed. He was not acting out of human strength, but out of divine connection. This is what so many believers fail to understand. Prayer is not about informing God of our needs. It is about aligning ourselves with His will. It is about syncing our hearts with His hearts, our desires with His desires, our plans with His plans. Jesus didn't pray because He was uncertain. He prayed because He was intentional. He was demonstrating what it means to live in daily communion with the Father. Prayer is not a ritual. It is a lifeline. It is not a duty. It is a privilege. It is the place where heaven meets earth, where we trade our weakness for His strength, where we exchange our confusion for His clarity, where we let go of our will and embrace His. And let me tell you something. The enemy fears a praying believer. Satan does not fear a person who reads about prayer, talks about prayer, or even listens to sermons about prayer. He fears the one who actually prays, because a person in constant communion with God is a person who walks in power. That's why the devil will do anything to keep you from the secret place. He will distract you, exhaust you, fill your schedule, and tell you that you're too busy to pray. Many of us treat prayer like a spare tire instead of a steering wheel. We go to God only when we're in trouble, only when we've exhausted every other option. But Jesus teaches us that prayer is not meant to be an emergency backup. It is meant to be the source of our daily strength. He prayed before decisions, not just after crises. He prayed before choosing the 12 disciples, Luke 6:12-13. He prayed before performing miracles. He prayed before facing the cross. And when he prayed, heaven responded. That's because prayer is not just communication. It is activation. It is the place where divine authority is released. Let me ask you, when was the last time you truly withdrew to pray? When was the last time you sat in the presence of God, not to ask for anything, but just to be with Him? When was the last time you prayed not out of obligation, but out of desperation for His presence? Because I'm telling you, if Jesus Himself needed to pray, we cannot afford to neglect it. It is not an option. It is our survival. It is not something we do when we have time. It is something we make time for. Jesus modeled perfect dependence on the Father to show us the way. And if we want to walk in His power, we must walk in His footsteps. If you believe in Jesus, type in the comments, "Lord, help me to walk in your steps." Number 3, the power of intercession. Jesus as our high priest. If Jesus was God, why did He pray? My brothers and sisters, He prayed because He came as our mediator, our intercessor, our great high priest. He did not pray because He lacked access to the Father. He prayed because He stood in the gap on our behalf. He was not seeking power. He was transferring it. He was not asking for permission. He was demonstrating His role as the bridge between God and man. This is the power of intercession, the sacred act of standing in the place of another, speaking on their behalf, covering them in prayer, and securing their victory before they even enter the battle. And Jesus did not just intercede for the disciples, He intercedes for us today. Hebrews 4:15-16 tells us, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet He did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." Jesus is our high priest. He prays for us, He advocates for us, and He covers us in the courts of heaven, ensuring that grace is always available to those who come to Him. Let me break this down for you. Jesus is like the greatest defense attorney the world has ever known. Imagine a courtroom. You stand accused, and the enemy, The prosecutor, Satan himself, brings up every failure, every mistake, every sin, every time you fall short. The evidence is stacked against you. You know you are guilty. You know the wages of sin is death. Romans 6:23. But just as the gavel is about to drop, Jesus, your advocate, your intercessor, your high priest, stands up and declares, "Father, I have already paid the price. This one belongs to me." He does not argue your innocence. He covers your guilt. He does not demand leniency. He offers himself as payment. And when the judge sees the blood of the Lamb, the verdict shifts from guilty to justified, from condemned to redeemed, from sentenced to set free. That is why Jesus prays, because he is standing in the gap, not just for the disciples of old, but for you and me today. One of the most powerful examples of Jesus' intercession is found in John 17, often called the high priestly prayer. As he prepared to go to the cross, he prayed not just for the 12, but for all who would believe in him, including you. He prayed, "Father, I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word." John 17:20. That means long before you were born, Jesus was praying for you. He saw your struggles, he saw your pain, he saw the battles you would face, and he interceded for you before you ever took your first breath. And what did he pray for? He prayed that we would be one as he and the Father are one, John 17:21, that we would be sanctified by the truth, John 17:17, and that we would be kept from the evil one, John 17:15. Jesus' prayers were not empty words. They were divine declarations that continue to echo in eternity. But that's not all. Look at Luke 22:31-32. Jesus, knowing that Peter was about to deny him 3 times, turned to him and said, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." Oh my God, Jesus knew Peter was going to fail, yet he did not pray that Peter wouldn't fall. He prayed that Peter's faith would not fail. Why? Because sometimes God is not trying to keep you from falling, he's trying to make sure you rise again. Jesus knew Peter would stumble, but he also knew that failure was not final when grace is in the equation. And because of Jesus' intercession, Peter, who once denied Christ, became the rock upon which the church was built. He preached at Pentecost, he led thousands to salvation, and he finished his race strong. Why? Because Jesus prayed for him. And let me tell you something, if Jesus prayed for Peter, he's praying for you too. The Bible tells us in Romans 8:34 that Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding for us. Right now, Jesus is seated in glory, still interceding for his people, still covering us, still standing in the gap. Every time the enemy accuses, Jesus reminds the Father that the price has already been paid. Every time we stumble, Jesus intercedes, ensuring that mercy triumphs over judgment. Every time we face trials, Jesus prays that our faith will not fail. And that ought to give you confidence in the midst of your struggles, because when Jesus prays, things shift. When Jesus intercedes, chains break. When Jesus speaks on your behalf, the outcome is already settled. So what does this mean for us? It means that we can face every trial with confidence, knowing that we are not fighting alone. It means that when the enemy comes in like a flood, we have an advocate who stands in our defense. It means that when we feel weak, we can hold on to the truth that Jesus has already prayed for us. Some of you are going through a storm right now. Some of you feel like you're about to lose everything. Some of you feel like you've failed too many times, like you've gone too far, like there's no hope for redemption. But I came to tell you that if Jesus prayed for Peter, he's praying for you too. If Jesus interceded for his disciples, he's interceding for you too. And if Jesus, the Son of the living God, is standing in the gap on your behalf, then no weapon formed against you shall prosper. No accusation of the enemy will stand. No storm will overtake you, because the blood speaks louder than your failures. His intercession is greater than your mistakes. His prayers secure your victory. And let me take it one step further. If Jesus, the King of Kings, took time to intercede for his people, then how much more should we be interceding for one another? If Jesus prayed for Peter, who are you praying for? If Jesus stood in the gap for you, who are you standing in the gap for? Because intercession is not just something Jesus does for us, it is something we are called to do for others. James 5:16 declares, "The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective." That means when you pray for your children, you are shifting their destiny. When you pray for your spouse, you are opening the heavens to your home. When you intercede for your family, you are breaking generational curses. When you cry out for your city, you are ushering in revival. Because prayer is not just words, it is warfare. And Jesus showed us that the greatest power is not in fighting battles with our fists, but in winning them on our knees. Number 4, Jesus as the ultimate example of submission and obedience. When Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, sweat like drops of blood falling to the ground, his voice trembling with the weight of the cross that loomed before him, he uttered the most powerful prayer of surrender ever recorded. "Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." Matthew 26:39. My brothers and sisters, this moment was not about weakness. It was about submission. It was not about doubt. It was about divine obedience. It was not about fear. It was about faith in the Father's plan. Jesus, fully God yet fully man, did not pray because he lacked power, but because he was modeling the highest level of obedience, total surrender to the will of God. And if the Son of God himself, who had the power to call down legions of angels, who had the authority to escape suffering, who had the divine ability to alter history, still bowed in submission to the Father's will, how much more should we? Think of a soldier on the battlefield. He has been trained, he is skilled, he carries weapons, he is prepared to fight. But no matter how strong or experienced he is, he does not move until he receives orders from his commanding officer. He does not act based on his own understanding, but in obedience to a greater strategy. Even though he has power, he submits to a higher command because he knows that true victory is found in following a plan. This is exactly what Jesus did. He was not powerless, he was submitted, he was not defeated, he was in divine alignment. And in that moment, he taught us the most powerful lesson of all. Surrender is not weakness, it is the pathway to victory. Because he chose to obey, he conquered death. Because he chose to submit, he secured salvation. Because he laid down his will, he picked up the crown of eternal glory. Philippians 2 says, "And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross." Oh my God, he humbled himself. He laid aside his own will. He didn't fight against the plan of God, he walked in it, and that is where so many of us struggle. We want the blessings of obedience without the surrender it requires. We want the reward without sacrifice. We want the crown without the cross. But Jesus showed us that true faith is not just believing in God, it is submitting to God. It is trusting Him when the path is difficult. It is obeying Him even when it costs us something. It is surrendering our plans, our desires, our ways, and saying, "Not my will, but yours be done." And this is where the battle is real. Many of us wrestle with God's will because it does not always look like what we expected. Some of you are struggling to let go of a relationship that God is telling you to release. Some of you are holding onto a career path that is pulling you away from your purpose. Some of you are resisting God's call because it requires stepping into the unknown. But let me tell you something, submission always comes before elevation. Before Jesus was given the name above every name, Philippians 2:9, he first had to bow down in obedience. Before he sat down at the right hand of the Father, he first had to kneel in surrender. And before you step into the fullness of what God has for you, you must first be willing to say, Lord, I trust you even when I don't understand. I submit even when it's hard. I obey even when it costs me everything. Jesus did not just pray in Gethsemane, he won the battle there. The victory of the cross was sealed the moment he said, "Not my will, but yours will be done." And this is what you need to understand. The greatest battles of your life will not be won in the public arena, but in the private place of prayer. The real fight is not against your circumstances. It is against your own will. It is against the desire to take control, to do things in your own way, to resist God's direction. But hear me today, when you surrender, you win. When you let go, God takes over. When you submit, he elevates you. If this word has spoken to you, if you are ready to surrender to God's will, I want you to type in the comments, Lord, I surrender. Let that be your declaration today. Let heaven hear it. Let the enemy know it. Let your own soul be reminded you are choosing God's will over your own. And if this message blessed you, make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video so we can spread the word of God. God bless you all.